Hi, and welcome to Books in Action. My name is Larry Petraccaro, and I have with me tonight Ina Rimpau. Ina is Adult Services Librarian at the Maplewood Library down on Baker Street. And she also runs a book club, Reading Around the World.
Read Around the World.
Read Around the World.
Yep.
I'm sorry, Read Around the World. So what we thought we'd talk about tonight is the Read Around the World book club, and maybe expand it a little bit into other types of book clubs. So Ina, tell us a little bit about that book club, the Read Around the World book club, and what made you decide to take that as a theme or as an approach?
Well, I thought it would be really interesting and important for us living in the States in this period to inform ourselves about what was going on in the world. And sure, you can read nonfiction, but fiction is maybe a more playful way to approach learning about different cultures and different ways of seeing the world and being in the world. So I decided to do an international book club where we would focus on recent fiction, and by recent I mean published since 2010 by authors outside of the U.S. And so there were over 100 countries, so reading one author a month for 10 months of the year. We've got years and years and years worth of books to read, even if we only do each country once. And I think the focus on recent fiction is important because that way we get to know emerging writers, the V.S. Naipals and the well-known writers. They really don't need to have their audience expanded, but the ones that are just coming out, but really putting out extraordinary work, it's really good, I think, to give them a boost and to give them an audience.
Okay. Well, in terms of some of the books, some of the countries you've gone to, do you have a list of countries you intend to get to, or is it the authors that dictate what you pick, or?
Well, what I did was I divided the world into separate regions: Europe, North America and the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, Africa. And so I take one from each part of the world. And I'm also considering the Near East a separate part, because there's so much going on there right now. So that we don't read like only Asian authors for a while, or only European authors. That would be too boring, I think. So we are always skipping around the world, and it makes for an even stronger contrast, I think, to see how very different people's lives are depending on where they are in the world.
Well, you mentioned earlier that you thought it was a easier or better, I forget the right term, but excuse me?
More playful?
More playful way
Yeah.
to understand about a different country than the fiction, than the nonfiction. So why is that? Why do you think that is?
Well, because every author writes through their own lens and their own experience, and when you're in a culture, there are things about it that you take for granted, that the rhythm of the day has a certain rhythm, that there are understood social mores. But when you go into another culture, that's simply not the case. And for us to be immersed in another culture, I think, is a really important lesson, how not all the world sees us in North America the way we see ourselves, and they don't see themselves or other countries the way that we do. The power, the distribution of power is very different. The level of control that people have over their lives is very different. It's shocking sometimes how very differently people live. And the kinds of struggles they go through, because one thing that we're reminded of again and again, especially when reading authors from developing countries, is how very privileged we are to live in a country where we turn the water tap on and drinkable water comes out, or we just assume that we can leave our houses and go about our business and not be unduly bothered by anything, that there's a functioning public transport system, functioning health system, and some countries, do it better than we do, admittedly.
Well, you mentioned that cultural context, trying to understand how we perceive things, I guess how they perceive things in their own country.
Right.
But doesn't that also just sort of a temporal context as well? I mean, I belong to a book club, and it always seemed to me that when we read a book that was written in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, that we had a tendency to evaluate the people and the circumstances in terms of our own current predisposition to things. So you would look at things and say, oh, this is terrible, when maybe people like that didn't think it was terrible. Is that sort of what you find that's helpful as well? In terms of the contemporary literature, not necessarily in terms of the time displacement, but in terms of the cultural displacement.
Sure. I mean, things that we find shocking or unheard of in our culture are part of the everyday, but that doesn't make them any less shocking or upsetting, There's this one book that we read about Malaysia where a young servant girl, who's a fairly important character in the book, at the beginning, fairly close to the beginning of the book, the author describes how when she was thrown out of the house, she was set up for something that she didn't do, and then she worked as a prostitute at some truck stop and died a young death. And to me, that's just horrific. I mean, this is a young girl that we're talking about, and I'm sure that is what happens to girls of that class in that part of the world. But it doesn't make it any less objectionable, more morally indefensible.
But would it be perceived the same way in Malaysia?
It would to upper class girls. They wouldn't dream of anything like that happening to them.
I was thinking in terms of the general population. I mean, if this book were read in Malaysia as opposed to being reading here,
right,
would the majority of people have the same opinion, or would they have seen this prostitution in this case as being just something that they might have expected a lower class person to wind up doing?
Not being Malaysian, I really don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think that's what you're kind of getting at.
Yeah.
You have to be open to the possibility that
Yeah.
what we see as good or
Yeah.
not so good may not be
Right.
the way somebody else would see it.
Right. But I still wouldn't give up my outrage and my being offended on the behalf of this character.
No, I understand that, but sometimes it's nice to recognize where your indignation comes from.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure,
as
yeah.
opposed, I mean, I remember, I guess when I first went to college, the world expanded so.
Yeah,
It was kind of it was a rather silly thing, but something that I took for granted. It was something simple as how I ate things.
Right.
I found out that what I did was unusual. And you don't think, you think what you do is usual.
Right.
Yeah. We read a book in the book club I'm in. You were mentioning Middle East before we I think got on the air. I think it was called the Yacubian Building, but it was written by a Middle Easterner, and the little bit of contemporary literature that's from a foreign country that I've read, there does seem to be, and maybe Western Europe's a little bit different, but when you get further away, there does seem to be some very distinct differences in the way we approach things.
Yeah.
Either whether you get upset or don't get upset.
Right.
Do you find any part of the world is more different, if you will, than any other part of the world? I mean, do you have any indication of that?
No, and I
Feeling
mean,
for
there
that.
are cultures within the U.S. that are as foreign to me as something that I could find on the other half of the world.
Really, such as
The fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, who live, under the thumb of these all-controlling patriarchs.
yeah.
I don't understand that lifestyle at all, and it's right here in this country. So.
Well, there's been a couple of books written about that. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
by John Krakauer. I forget who wrote it, but and I guess it's not just Utah. There's segments of the United States, I guess, out in the far west that are pretty much isolated.
Arizona,
Yeah,
Mexico,
yeah. It's sort of like that, which is kind of intriguing when you think about it, because I think it's difficult sometimes to take yourself out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that must be something that this helps with as well.
Exactly, exactly.
And how do the members that attend the meetings, do they kind of see it the same way? Do they see it differently? Or?
What some of them have said to me is that because of the books that we read, they find themselves reading books that they would never have considered reading otherwise. In the beginning, I thought we could have a sort of democratic decision on what they wanted to read, but they really didn't. They really were happy to have me select the books, and then we just all read them together. And it's very hit or miss. You know, some books are a pleasure to read; others you really have to work very hard. With some you work hard and it's very worth it. With others you work hard and you still kind of wonder, okay, what was that? But it's still worth it just for the novelty factor to expose yourself to something completely different.
No, I agree with you. Are any of these books, I mean, you mentioned one from South Africa, you mentioned that one from Malaysia.
Yeah.
The one from South Africa, would that have been written in English, or would that have been written in Afrikaans, or would that have been written in some?
I believe these two were written in English, but a lot of the ones that we've read are in translation. And also that's quite a high bar for a foreign country to reach, that usually the book has to do well in the country of origin and then be of interest enough for an English language publisher to buy the rights and finance the translation. So think of, that's like several bars for a country to jump, and especially for developing countries who are just so needy for basic amenities for most people. It's, I've got countries that haven't published anything in English for like 30 years,
Really?
just because that's just not a focus. The fiction, anyways. Yeah, it's a bit of a luxury, really.
Well, what about expatriates from those countries that come to our country, for example? They would presumably write in English.
Sure.
Have you read any of that? And, even though it might not be set in a foreign country, it's an author that presumably brings that perspective to this country.
Right.
And would, have you done that?
No. There's some excellent writers. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is an example. And that's a different experience. And my focus was to try and find out, what is it like to live in a culture that is not the United States? What do we look like from there? What do they look like from their own vantage point? It's, not to say that the books aren't worth reading, they definitely are, but it's a different focus than what I'm looking for.
Okay, your focus is to kind of immerse as much as possible in that.
To sort of reverse the telescope, if you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it sounds interesting. It's, I think reading, obviously, reading is important, and to have to, and to use it as a vehicle for, challenging the presumptions that you have about the way things work, I think is a really good idea. Well, we're going to have to take a break, so we'll be back in a minute. So if you'll stay with us, we'll be back in about a minute. And I'm here with Ina Rimpau, and we're talking about Read Around the World. I think that's Read Around the World. Read Around the World, and we'll continue that when we get back. So stay with us.
After 17 years working as a mason, Mike was laid off. I met him when he came into the library looking for help. He found a job opening, but the application was only online. Mike said he'd spent his entire life around tools, but had never used a computer. I showed him how, and he ended up applying for numerous jobs online. I saw Mike the other day. His new computer skills paid off. He's working again.
New Jersey libraries are transforming lives. Tell us your story.
Hi, welcome back to Books in Action. This is Larry Petraccaro with Ina Rimpau, and we've been talking about Read Around the World. And we're going to continue that conversation. But just to get a couple of things out of the way, when does the book club meet? How often do you meet? And can anybody join? And can anybody join at any time they want?
We meet once a month, generally the first Wednesday evening of the month from 7 to 8. It's on the library's website. There are also flyers in the library. Anybody can join. We've had people join our discussion who haven't read the book at all. That's fine. And you'll get more out of it if you read the book. And it's drop in. We have readers who come sometimes, maybe judging by if they like the book or not. You know, it's understandable. Everybody has a busy life, and it's very, very open and very very welcoming, I would say.
And how many people typically, is there a typical number?
There's about 6 that come regularly, yeah.
So that makes for a more intimate conversation, I suppose.
And we know one another, and we sort of have an idea of who's going to bring up what in the discussion. It's very interesting, yeah. But it's you know, it's still different every time. It's really fun.
You meet in the Maplewood Memorial Library?
That's right.
One of the meeting rooms?
In
or
the
down-
Durand room.
The Durand room.
Off the children's room.
Off the children's room,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So speaking of these meetings, I guess sometimes they're livelier than others. Is there any book that, for whatever reason, really grabbed people and generated, you know, a pretty interesting conversation?
Well, what's interesting is that the more interesting conversations happen when people disagree.
Okay.
Or sometimes you can all disagree, and generally there is a consensus like, oh, this was a really good book, or oh boy, that was a real slog getting through this. And then we read a book this past fall called Submission by Michel Houellebecq, a French writer. And his book actually came out the day of the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris. And it is a book about an Islamic takeover of the government of France. So it was extremely controversial when it came out. It was seen as being anti-Islamic, and having read books that dealt with Islam and were based in the Middle East before that, you know, we went in knowing a certain amount. For example, that the subjugation of women isn't an integral part of Islam. It's not a part of Islamic teachings. It's actually a regional issue. It's from that part of the world. And when I was reading reviews of the book, one of the plot points that the author has is that the reason the Islamic takeover is successful is because they deal with unemployment by stripping women of their jobs and giving the jobs to all the unemployed men. And I couldn't understand that nobody pointed out that the French are people who have general strikes for vacation, and the thought that there wouldn't be massive uprisings on stripping half of the population of their livelihoods and of their autonomy was just absurd to me. I mean, there's the whole point of the satire is it has to be credible, and that to me was absolutely not credible. That you know, women would just roll over and, you know, give their 15-year-old daughters away as second and third wives to middle-aged men, and just the sexism was astonishing to me. And you know, you have books about with what's called an unreliable narrator, like the person who's speaking in the first person, and you realize usually gradually as a reader that you can't really take everything they say as the truth because they've got their own slant on it. And I said, well, this is a book of an unlikable narrator, because I felt that the narrator was letting a lot of his own sort of just not seeing women as full human beings, his own blind spots through. And you know, how do you get through a book by a narrator who you just dislike as a person? You know, it was an interesting exercise because I really had to sort of try and judge the book as a work of art and not just as this very objectionable view of the world. It's hard for me to separate that. But, you know, it made for a lively discussion.
Well, did most people support you, or did you have people that disagreed with that approach? Or with your perception of it?
They didn't disagree with it. They thought it was an interesting way to look at it. You know, one of the ways to look at it. And it was, you know, it was an interesting book also because it also described how the character was going back historically in France and trying to think of when people first thought of themselves as unitary beings and not just part of a community. And then he describes this Madonna, who is a Madonna from the very early Middle Ages, who's now a shrine in France. And I got a picture of that, and it's an incredibly primitive sculpture in that it's a wooden sculpture and it's barely recognizable as a woman and child. But he puts you in this place of the narrator where he's looking at this, and it just comes on him on what it means to be looking at this and seeing that as a unique piece, as not just part of the community and part of a church and part of the religion, but as this one unique piece, and that from that derived, the Enlightenment and all this kind of thing, which made the French Revolution possible, which made modern French society possible. So in that way, it was quite interesting because it sort of tied into the historical moment that France found itself in. But he also talked about, how Islam won because it was a more masculine religion, and Christianity was too feminine because the focus was too much on suffering and forgiveness and this sort of thing. So a lot of ideas from, a guy that I really wouldn't like to have to talk to at a party, for example.
Well, do you think that the narrator did that intentionally, or do you think that was just his personality, was somebody you wouldn't want to know?
Who knows, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say that the entire thing is just artifice, but
Well,
that was my sense.
As a narrator, was he narrating as a Frenchman or as a Muslim, or
As a Frenchman, as a
as
Christian.
a Frenchman, as a Christian Frenchman?
Yeah.
And he had accepted this change of circumstance in France?
Well, part of the book it's basically a critique on how the intellectual elite of France basically just rolls over and accepts it. Like the men see, what have I got to gain from this? Full employment. I can have as many wives as I want. They're going to pay me more money. I don't have intellectual freedom, but who cares about that? Their material circumstances to them, just wipe away any doubts they might have about wanting to accommodate this.
Those certainly book got your attention, and I guess the other members of the book club.
Yeah.
Have there been any other books like that, or that maybe not quite that vehement attention, but something that's memorable to you?
There was a book that we read about Jordan. The title is Mother of All Pigs, a novel.
Mother of All Pigs?
Yes, it's a
From a Muslim country?
yeah.
Okay.
It's a striking title, and the main character is a butcher named Hussein, who's actually part of the Christian minority in Jordan. Jordan has one of the oldest Christian minorities in the Near East. They're right next to Israel, so it makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
And what we realize as we're reading about his life is that although he doesn't follow the same religion as his neighbors and customers, he's subjected to the same sort of social control they are. They all believe that marriages have to be arranged, that women have to be pure until they're married, that fathers and sons have absolute control over their relations, they talk about the disillusionment after the Arab Spring. That's when the novel here takes place, and how they thought that one of the characters, a young woman says, well, what's the difference finally between a religious government and a secular one? They both torture us. They don't have freedom of the press under either of them. Women are still treated like less than fully human. And so the mother of all pigs is actually this very fertile sow that Hussein gets manages to buy in hopes will make him extraordinary profits, which she does for a while, but then Islamic extremists force him to give up that part of his business. And again, it showed us that the more restrictive aspects of what we're told is Islamic culture is really a regional issue and not one that is part of the religion per se.
That's an interesting insight too, because I think at least I know I probably have a tendency to lump everybody together. I think maybe that's a common characteristic of people is to try to quantify rather than qualify.
Right,
You know, because
right.
people are individuals, but but groups of this. It's like what went on today with the last couple of days with that viral video, or any video for that matter. It seems so difficult to get to the truth. So what are you reading right now? Just
We just started reading The Woman Next Door by a South African writer, Yewanda Motoso. And it's about two women who are neighbors in this quite upscale, pleasant neighborhood in, I think it's Cape Town, a suburb of Cape Town, one white and one black, and they bring with them their respective histories and their backgrounds. And I'm just at the beginning of the novel, but it's right at the beginning. The white woman describes how her housekeeper, who's a black South African, is coming, and she's got these treats for the housekeeper and her children, and the housekeeper is coming to visit, and her neighbor is growing increasingly irate as she's listening to this white woman explain like how generous she is and kind and thoughtful, and finally says to her, look, if she were visiting, she wouldn't be cleaning your house. And just the weight of her own community and her own history, and knowing the history of South Africa, that this is essentially stolen land. Like, what do you mean you're being generous to them because you're buying them a snack? Like, you're on their land. How can you even where do you get the nerve to pat yourself on the back?
Yeah.
So
That's
it'd be an interesting read.
yeah, and that's, I think, kind of encompasses very succinctly in some ways the way your perspective can be so different than what it really should be,
Right.
and to try to find a way to at least understand,
Exactly.
what the other person might be feeling.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Have you read anything from South America?
Yes, we read The Neighborhood by Mario Vargas Llosa, and we read Savage Theories by Paula Olishera. I'm sorry, I never figured out how to pronounce the last name. That was a tricky one. There are, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Some different books.
we only have a minute or so left.
Yeah.
Is there any area of the world that you've found more interesting or fascinating or more difficult? Any one of those?
No, it's all so varied.
All interesting, fascinating,
Yeah,
and difficult every
yeah,
place.
Yeah, everywhere you look.
Everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the book club meets, you said mostly, when's the first Wednesday?
Wednesdays, mostly the first Wednesday, but check the website.
Check
Yeah.
the website. So anyone who's interested in getting a perspective on a different part of the world, it might be a good opportunity to get down to the public library in Maplewood. And you probably don't even have to, do you have to belong to the library? Don't even have to belong to the library, so as long as you know how to read. So keep reading, and thank you, Ina, for joining us. This has been Larry Petraccaro with Books in Action, and join us next time.